Hello, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropo scene. Hello.
Hello,
Welcome back to
everybody.
another snip. We are going to deviate a little bit from the traditional snip format, more so than we normally deviate from it. And we are going to answer questions that were submitted by listeners, friends, and people who follow me on Instagram. So, for those of you who submitted questions, I really appreciate that. I'm not going to shout you guys out by name because I did not ask for permission. Perhaps next time I will do that. But essentially, I asked people to ask questions for Kirsten and I to answer on this snip of the podcast. So we're going to go through a few of them. We obviously won't be able to answer all of them because there was hundreds of submissions. That's not true at all. There was like less than a dozen. But regardless, if you guys in the future want to submit more questions and things like that for another episode like this and you like this format, DM us on the Anthropo scene or on our personal Instagrams if it's something that applies to us specifically. I think for the most part, the questions that I got apply to ecology to some degree, and only like one of them is directed specifically at me. So we'll both take turns answering them to the best of our abilities. Some of them were asked to me specifically on Instagram, so it's probably geared to my experiences and knowledge. And this is technically my episode of Anthropo Snips, so I might just be fielding a lot of these questions more thoroughly on my side. And also, Kirsten has not looked at these questions at all. I had the luxury of looking at them. So, in order, we're going to go with first house sparrows, maybe Eurasian tree sparrows, and their effects on native cavity nesters. So, specifically, I will talk about house sparrows because I don't really know Eurasian tree sparrow ecology very much, but house sparrows are so prolific as an invasive species and a non-native species in the US that I know a fair amount about their habits and their effects on local ecosystems, specifically other nesting birds. I'm not confident enough to say I know the effects on cavity nesters specifically, but I can definitely talk about house sparrow effects on typical native fauna. So, house sparrows are an introduced species of sparrow from somewhere else in the world. I don't know off the top of my head. By the way, I didn't research any of these questions. All of these questions are being answered off of my specific knowledge. So, tree sparrows, although we don't necessarily know the full extent of what their impacts are, they are known to evict other nesting birds from their nesting sites with regularity. So they will evict many different species of other nesting birds, but it's not just that they're pulling them out of their nests or irritating them enough to where they leave. They will break eggs. They will push young out of the nest. And apparently there's been instances where they've like killed adult nesting female birds who are sitting on the nest as well, which is ridiculous to think about because if you know what a house sparrow is, it's a small bird. Like it doesn't look like a very intimidating bird, but they are super aggressive and will nest anywhere they can in the best potential nesting site. And that, of course, means doing what they do best and pushing out the native species, which isn't to any fault of their own. It's just how they naturally behave. It's just in their natural habitat, they would be confined by predators, and probably the birds there have resistance and know how to ward them off. So there are definitive effects on house sparrows, and I would assume Eurasian tree sparrows, on native nesting bird populations. So there you go.
Just surprised.
Do you have anything?
Sparrows just look so derpy.
Right. They're not like, yeah, they're not an intimidating bird. Like they're little kind of, not to be confused with house finches, which are gorgeous, especially during breeding season. But like house sparrows are these little like kind of, well, I guess they kind of have like a bandit mask face, right?
I guess.
So I mean, yeah, but they're not like they're a sparrow. Like if you're thinking of a sparrow, you're probably thinking of a house sparrow for the most part, because it's like one of the most common birds that I see just in general in the United States.
I had to double check. I was like, I'm thinking of the right bird, right? Yeah, they just look so cuddly and.
Yeah, they're not intimidating. No. The next question is, can you talk about the differences between native and invasive Phragmites, which is great. And I'm actually not going to go in too much detail about this because we do have well, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We definitely have an episode recorded, or not recorded, but written about invasive semi-aquatic grasses like Phragmites and reed canary grass. But essentially, native versus invasive Phragmites. There are native versions of Phragmites within the United States and Canada and North America. There are also invasive Phragmites introduced pretty much entirely around the world, to the point where it took us a long time to determine where Phragmites actually originated because of how invasive and widespread that species is. So the fun part about the native versus invasive Phragmites is the native Phragmites does not grow obviously as thick and aggressive as the invasive Phragmites, which will literally cut off water flow where it grows. Unfortunately, the native species does hybridize with the non-native species. So it's essentially a cattail situation where you've got these hybrids that behave very similarly to the non-native Phragmites and are therefore need to get treated in the same manner. So what you need to do is pre-manage native Phragmites. If you only have a population of native Phragmites, you can preserve that. However, if you have a population with both native and non-native, it's probably in your best interest to eradicate the non-native Phragmites. And in my experience, native Phragmites, at least the North American variety of Phragmites, I can't remember the species epithet for it. The non-native variety is Phragmites australis, but the native one has more of like a red sheath to it, and it doesn't get as tall or as fluffy fluorescence. It's still pretty fluffy, but it's not to the same degree as the non-native one. But also, my knowledge of it could be skewed in the fact that I don't know if what I was treating was truly native or if it was the hybridized native, non-native versions. So I think that pretty much covers that question to the degree of not getting too much into our full episode on that later.
I found Phragmites australis. Does that sound right to you?
That's the non-native one, yes.
That's the non-native one. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know what the native one is, the species epithet. The next question is, New Zealand is going to deter their invasive hedgehogs. What do you think is the best method to do so? While I'm explaining this, Kirsten, can you look up what deter might mean? Because I don't think that's necessarily a term that we use. I'm operating under the assumption that deter is either culling or controlling the populations of non-native hedgehogs. That's what I'm going to answer this as, unless Kirsten, changes it. So,
right, yeah, I'll take a look.
Just to reiterate the question, what is the best method to deter their invasive hedgehogs? Because obviously they're already there, so deter in this situation probably would not mean to prevent them from entering the ecosystem because they've already established it. At least that's what I'm assuming. So the best method for culling invasive hedgehogs, in my opinion, is probably going to be a trap and euthanize method. I don't think, and we'll actually address this in a later question, so I'm not going to talk about trap, neuter, release yet. But with hedgehogs, what you would have to do is find a method that essentially you'd probably have to put burrowed traps, which are traps that are put underground or hidden in like tunnels and things like that, where the hedgehogs are typically going to be most of the time. And you can bait those traps, and essentially the hedgehogs go in, and then they're humanely euthanized after that. It's a drastic and not fun type of method of control, but it is a necessary method of control because New Zealand is such a fragile and small, relatively speaking, ecosystem. And introduced species with no predators like hedgehogs that can have effects on, being that they're insectivorous and their burrows affect the floristic life as well, they could have massive detrimental effects on the populations there. So unfortunately, as sad as it is, I think that a trap and euthanize method is going to be the best way. Australia has done this in the past with camels, goats, and other things. The Galapagos Island also has done a massive euthanizing with goats. And also there's other methods that worked for goats in the Galapagos where they would release sterile females So the males would try to reproduce with them, but it wouldn't work. Or was it sterile males? Either way, one sex was sterilized and it reduced the amount. So they thought they were breeding and then it would reduce. I don't know if that would translate to hedgehogs. I don't know hedgehog breeding populations. I don't know if they would just go and try and breed again with a fertile individual or however that works. But that might also be something. I'm not crazy versed in hedgehogs like at all. That's a European thing. I mean, we have them as pets here, but like it's not even common for that. So these are just I'm just operating up based off my assumptions on what I think is the best method for large scale control of invasive species like that in general. When in mammals, it is unfortunately most of the time going to be humanely euthanizing them. That being said, I will address another addition to that method when we talk about cats in the final question that we'll have today.
So, just chiming in, from the Department of Conservation in New Zealand, it appears that they are killing them because hedgehogs are not only harming like insects and stuff, they also are eating a ton of bird eggs, and they are really hurting the bird population. So it looks like they are employing trap and kill methods for sure, and they're encouraging local people to also go ahead and set up traps in their backyard in burrows, baited traps, because not a lot of things burrow in New Zealand, so you don't have to worry about birds or the pets or anything like that, or children.
Except tuataras.
Yeah. So there is still a couple things, but so there's a page on that. Also a little, I can't not with the thing in Galapagos as well. With the goats, they were shooting a lot of the goats from like a helicopter, and the point when it got too difficult to find the goats, they would like put a collar on a female that would like run and find like a herd of goats, and they're like, oh, another friend, and then they would massacre them. So
right, it wasn't. I think I read anecdotally. I read something on that. They were like, "Oh, look, this goat's coming," and this goat like would always just watch the massacre of all these, which is sad to think about in that means. But like, it does. Animals don't function in the same way that we do as far as emotions go. But yeah. So, do you remember about the sterility thing though? Because wasn't the female sterile so that I thought
maybe
the female was sterile so that she could. So like when she found, like she wouldn't be impregnated or something like that.
But,
I can't remember. So I'm paraphrasing. Moving right along to the next question. Cuban tree Cuban tree frog in Florida. What do we do? So Cuban tree frogs are like a super prolific non-native species that I don't actually know enough about to know what their detrimental is. I know there's obviously going to be niche occupancy. Of course, they're taking the native tree frogs niche. If they're super prolific, they can have negative effects on the insect populations. That also makes sense. The thing with Florida, I'm just going to go off a general thing here, is Florida will function best in the future and be able to preserve its ecosystems if all potential invasive species in the pet trade are regulated. And we've taken a firm stance on that in a past episode when we've addressed this. And we still stand by that stance, is that the legislation needs to be in place and the research needs to be done where if an animal could potentially become invasive if introduced into that ecosystem, it needs to be restricted as far as how you can own it. And most of the time, I think it should be that you can't own that animal at all because you're going to disrupt the natural ecosystem, which in every case is never good. So overall, more regulation needs to be done. The Cuban tree frog is so prolific in Florida that managing them would be incredibly difficult. You could micromanage populations where, you go out and you catch them and then euthanize them and things like that. But I don't know if it's feasible to actually control that population to the point that it is at now. So, but if we prevent the introduction of more species while simultaneously culling the invasive species that have established, at some point you're going to put some sort of dent in it, as long as that method is quicker than they can proliferate, which at this point one could argue that you can't call them fast enough because of how readily they proliferate. So Cuban tree frogs, they might just be there forever. I think at this point Florida is more of we've got bigger fish to fry with a lot of their invasives. So not to say that the Cuban tree frog isn't detrimental in its own right to its own occupying niche species, but at the same point, it's not probably as directly detrimental on the native flora and fauna of Florida as some of the other invasive herpetofauna may be. Next, impacts off-leash dogs have on reptile and amphibian boards or sensitive plants or in general. So a lot of times we do focus on cats. And I think there's a strong resistance to cats. Obviously, there's the ongoing fight between, outdoor cat people and scientists who, understand the detriments of cats. But a lot of times we see as dogs being totally okay to be out off leash in forest preserves and things like that, when in reality, that's not the case. Dogs are also predators. They might not be geared to predation as much as cats are, but dogs will still chase things and unintentionally kill them because they might just be playing with it. Cats will intentionally kill things most of the time. Dogs will also do so, but probably not to the same extent as cats. So I think the question was directed specifically at herpetofauna. There are several conservation districts and forest preserves in the area that have strict no dogs allowed, because when dogs were allowed there, they had direct impacts on the native herpetofauna, generally sensitive herpetofauna. A dog is going to see a turtle and pick up a turtle in its mouth and carry it away. If it's a box turtle and that dog carries it outside of its habitat, that turtle could die. Also, of course, the direct impacts of being in a dog's mouth. If the dog's chewing on it, not understanding what it's doing. Dogs will kill snakes sometimes. It's just not necessarily a predatory response, but a defensive response. And in general, it's not good for your dogs. In southern Illinois, there is a stretch of road called Snake Road in LaRue Pine Hills Conservation Area that is set aside every year specifically for the crossing of venomous snakes and other like 22, I think, snake species, maybe more than that, but a lot of different snake species. And every year I go down there, I see people with their dogs off leash. Last year when I was down there, 2 dogs got bit by cottonmouths on that road in the same day because people had them off leashes. Dogs are not intentionally stupid, but they're not exactly smart as far as like critical thinking goes. I mean, they're curious animals. That's how they learn. So they're going to get up close and sniff something. If a cottonmouth sees a giant dog come up to them, or even just any size dog, because a cottonmouth is not a big snake, it's going to assume that's a predator and it's going to hurt it. And a venomous snake is going to bite a dog. Dogs are, as a standard, generally more resistant to venom, but that doesn't mean they're going to be okay. So leash your dogs. If you're going to have a dog, be responsible with it. If you're taking it into nature, you got to leash your dog. And if you say, well, then dogs shouldn't be leashed, they should be allowed to roam free. Well, they're not native to this ecosystem. And if you don't think that, then you shouldn't keep a dog. So that's your solution right there. So we have to understand that dogs are great. I love dogs. They're incredible animals. But if left to their own devices, dogs will eat plants that will kill them. So, I mean, like, you need to protect your dog as well as protect the sensitive ecosystems that are around you. Just like you police your dog from eating things that they shouldn't, police your dog around wildlife and things like that. I'm not saying it has to be on a leash all the time, but your dog should be trained that if you say it can't mess with something, that it comes back to you and stays away from that wildlife. And then also be vigilant of your dog, because that second you look away from your dog, it could have a sensitive animal in its mouth and kill it. I think I've addressed that question enough.
Right, yeah, and it's a thing of like ecological responsibility and responsible pet ownership, like you said. Something also too that we've seen here in Ecuador as an issue, more so in stray dogs, because there's like a really, really big problem with the stray dog population. So here's the like little soapbox of please sterilize your dogs no matter where you are in the world. Like, you do not need to have a bunch of puppies and abandon them. But they chase off, for example, condors here are really endangered, and they chase off condors off of carcasses and things like that, which causes the condors to not have food. And then another huge thing is these dogs get into these big, like, actually dangerous packs of stray dogs in the farmlands. And so people put out poison meat for dogs, and it poisons then the vultures and like different like carnivorous birds and detrivores and things like that. Yeah, scavengers. Oh, there's the word. So yeah, that's just my little input from something that I've especially noticed here and something that a lot of people have been talking about. So
Right. That's also, and that kind of leads us into the cat question, but I'm still going to save that for last. This one is more of a jab at me. How do I ID wild plants? I have the key and everything, but it all just ends up being asparagus. This is from one of my interns who will remain nameless, but he and I were out last year and we were IDing plants, and I just had a complete brain fart and I called a plant asparagus, and I was just dead sure about it, super confident. I was like, what else would it be? And then not like 15 minutes later, I walked up and I was like, oh no, wait, that's asparagus. I don't know what that other plant was. So I'm going to take this jab at my plant identification abilities, which are, although I have talked them down, I would say pretty decent. Yeah, they mentioned a key, and he brings up a good point, is that keys can be very not subjective. They're very specific and they're very good at identifying plants. But if you want to visually identify plants and things like that, just spend time outside throughout multiple growing seasons. So you go out in the spring, the summer, winter, and fall. Obviously, winter plants are going to be dormant. I can still identify plants in their dormant states in the winter because of factors that you essentially just key into after looking at them for an extended period of time. It's repetition. The more you see a plant, the more you understand it. The basal leaves, when a plant starts growing, might look entirely different from the adult leaves later in the season when that plant is fully grown. So you have to understand that if you're doing from a management perspective, you need to know the plants not only when they're in a flowering period, but when they're in a dormant period and when they're in a basal period where they're not exhibiting a lot of the traits that they exhibit later. So you know if you need to remove or keep that specific plant. So it's repetition. And then of course, once you get repetition down and you understand a lot of plants from a specific area, you can't learn all the plants in the world. So it's good to have keys or regional keys for the plants for where you're going. And you can pick up on shared traits between the plants of where you're from and the plants of where you're going, like opposite leaves, your alternating leaves, world leaves, the venation in the leaves, the margins, how serrated or smooth they are, how pubescent or non-pubescent a stem or a leaf is, which is just hairy or not hairy, the type of flowers and the flower structure. All of that can go into bettering your plant knowledge and understanding plant identification. It's daunting at first, but in reality, plants are very easy to identify once you've seen them. They have a lot less variation than one might think. I'm thinking of animals, which have significantly more variation in them than plants. If you're asking me my personal opinion on that, I'm much more confident in my plant ID than I am with a lot of my fauna ID. So, two more questions, and we'll wrap right up. And this one I'm going to try and keep brief, but can you please explain prescribed burns? So I'm not going to go through the entire process, but I will go through the importance of prescribed burns, what they are, and what they do. So prescribed burns, which used to be called controlled burns, but for legal purposes can no longer be called controlled burns because it's never technically under control because you don't know what environmental factors could change to affect the movement of that prescribed burn. So prescribed burns are done in areas where fires would naturally occur to essentially remove the natural buildup of organic material that condenses over years and years. So once
Accumulates.
accumulates, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that accumulation can actually hinder the effectiveness of the growth of the plants that are underneath it. And naturally, a burn would remove that and allow the plants to grow back stronger. On top of that, native plants that are used to being burned have deeper root systems and are therefore able to store a lot of energy in there. And then when they're exposed to the sun, they actually grow significantly quicker on those open post-burn months than they would in a non-burned area. Now, we use that as a management strategy for cultural management practices. Indigenous people have been doing burns for tens of thousands of years as a means of hunting and things like that, but it's essentially great for the floristic ecosystems, especially ones that have been invaded by non-native species of plants. So the non-native species of plants, most of the time, don't have the deep root systems that the native plants do. So when you run a burn over the top of them, they're not able to survive that burning, and therefore they are eradicated from an area through a burn, which then, of course, in turn allows the native plants to grow back stronger and, kind of retake over that invaded seed bank. It gives them a better chance. Also, burns are super beneficial for taking that organic matter and all those nutrients and breaking them down very, very small, because when you burn, you're essentially burning everything down to ash, and the ash is synthesized into the soil in a much quicker manner than the general breakdown and decay of that organic matter that would naturally take place. So the fire essentially is just speeding that up, which makes the soils more rich and therefore adds more nutrients to help sustain the native ecosystems that are there. So prescription burns are done both for management and control, but also just to help the establishment of these, native plants and get rid of the invasive ones. I'm specifically, of course, talking about prairies here. Prescription burning is used all over the world in different ecosystems as a means of managing and in fire reduction. And that sounds maybe counterintuitive when I say it like that. But if you remove that built up, or if you allow that organic matter to stay built up and continuously build up, you're going to have a much hotter fire, a fire that would naturally be ignited by lightning many, many years before that buildup, and therefore would create a slower, less hot burn that would be less detrimental to housing and things like that. But also, when you get a burn that's so hot because it hasn't naturally burned in, hundreds of years because people have done fire suppression techniques, that fire can burn so hot that it can render the ground underneath it unable to sustain life. It chemically changes the soil structure and eradicates everything in the seed bank to the point where nothing grows there for years and years after. So fires that happen in areas where they've been suppressed for years and years are significantly worse than if we were to just do regular cultural burning practices to reduce the buildup of organic matter. We would have significantly less drastic fires. On top of that, you add in climate change and drought conditions and things like that, and you get exacerbated fire conditions, which of course could also be suppressed if we were to trust indigenous peoples and their cultural burning practices that they were doing for thousands of years before the white man came. That's the basis of prescription burning. I could go on for episodes and episodes about this, but for the purpose of this little snip, we're going to move on to the final question, and the most controversial. And it actually starts with controversial, but perspectives on TNR, or trap and youth for outdoor cats. So TNR is trap, neuter, and release, meaning that the animals are, and this is specifically for cats. So this means that the animals are trapped in cages, they're neutered, and then re-released so they cannot reproduce, and therefore theoretically reduce populations overall. Here is why I think trap, neuter, release is a fruitless effort that is a waste of time and money and resources. Trap, neuter, release may render that specific cat that is caught sterile, but it doesn't render the cats that aren't caught sterile, and they can still reproduce. And the amount of feral cats in the US will never, ever, ever be reduced by the amount of trap, neuter, release methods that we do. We can't do it on a scale that is effective enough to combat the amount that feral cats can proliferate in the United States. Also, to add to that, trap, neuter, release is a fruitless effort because even if those cats aren't reproducing, you're still releasing them and they're still killing the animals. So the issue we're having with feral cats is that they're killing billions of animals every single year. If you neuter that animal, it's not going to stop it from killing things. It's just going to not be able to reproduce. It's still going to kill things, and the other cats are still going to continue to reproduce. Now, this is where euthanasia comes in. Yeah, it's the only effective way to do it, and it sucks. And I understand that people like cats, but you have to get over the fact that your cat that you keep inside might not be a problem, but the cats that are feral and killing off our native biodiversity are a massive problem. They are causing the global decline in species, unlike almost any other invasive species on a global scale. They are extremely detrimental hyper carnivores that just kill for fun and instinct and are wiping out sensitive ecosystems. Now, that being said, do we need to go out and just blow the heads off every little cat that we see in the streets? No, we don't need to do that. We can take in as many cats as adoption shelters can handle, as they can be adopted. But very quickly, we will find that adoption centers are overwhelmed by the amount of cats that they get in, and they will have to be euthanized. So any number that is over that set amount of adoptable cats need to be euthanized. They can't be relocated because they're detrimental in any ecosystem that they're put in. They're not native because they're domesticated, and a lot of times feral cats aren't even good for adoption. Now, some people will argue with me on this, but there's a lot of people who will say that feral cats maintain a lot more instincts, and they're not the same as cats that are, born in captivity or things like that. So I don't necessarily, I understand that people love cats, but I can't fathom the idea of I love cats, so you can't kill cats out in the wild. Nobody wants to kill cats. I mean, some psychopaths probably want to kill cats, but nobody in a sane mind wants to go out and just murder a bunch of cats. As much as I despise cats and what they have and the effects they have on native biodiversity, I love cats. Indoor cats that don't go outside. They're great pets. They're better pets than dogs in many cases because dogs require a lot more space and care and things like that. Cats are great because they can survive inside with enough enrichment to maintain a happy and healthy lifestyle. That's great. But when they're released outside, they're apex predators that destroy ecosystems. And the unfortunate truth is that they must be euthanized in order to stop the destruction of our native ecosystems and biodiversity. That's just the truth of it. That's coming from somebody who has experience, who is almost 10 years of experience, which isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it is in my lifetime, of direct experience with many, many different invasive species. You have to sometimes be drastic because if you don't take the most drastic effect, what's going to happen is these invasive species are so successful that they overcome any less effective methods. You have to do the most drastic method because they are so prolific. It is unnatural. Invasive species are unnatural. There is no natural competition for invasive species because they're introduced by humans to places they would never naturally get to. And if they did naturally get there from like a land bridge or something like that, it would still not be to the extent of what they do in the scale that humans have introduced them. So a lot of times people are like, well, let's try this instead. It's just the unfortunate truth is sometimes you have to go with the most drastic and uncharismatic method of control to reduce the populations of these invasive species. So that is a shame. And nobody wants to kill cats, but nobody wants the destruction of biodiversity. So that's my soapbox for that. And that also brings us to the end of this snip. I don't have any more questions, but I think Kirsten might actually have one.
I do have one. I do just want to I know you talked a lot already about the cats, but I just wanted to add my tiny little snip on the end. I'm a recent cat mom as well. I have adopted a little kitten. But also as well with the trap and neuter and release, these resources could also go towards adopting off more of the cats that are adoptable, right? To bettering centers in ways to hold more capacity and to help get these out, and making sterilization campaigns as well, because a lot of people say they don't sterilize their animals because it's expensive. So then these organizations can make it more affordable for them to bring in their pets and that kind of thing. So to direct our resources in more viable ways, right? And unfortunately, of course, it's not a fun time, people out here just taking cats and killing them. But for the really feral cats, putting them back out there, it's not doing much. And there's other ways we can help address the issue.
Absolutely.
I received one question from Instagram and it was just asking about the kind of some common traits that invasive species have. So adaptations for that. So this is tough because there's a huge range of different types of invasive species, but definitely some things that are very common. You have things that reproduce quickly and have short lifespans.
Yes.
So, an orangutan would make the worst invasive species because they take forever to mature and forever to reproduce. But things with, short lifespans, quick reproduction, large litter or seed sizes.
Right. High reproductive potential.
Exactly. High reproductive potential. Then also, too, you have things that have a really large, thermal threshold. So they can withstand cold and hot temperatures, because then they are more likely to be able to invade larger areas and different regions. If something has a really specific temperature that it likes, it's not going to do well in another region. And then resistance to pesticides or to insecticides or different things. So animals or plants that are just tough bastards. You know, they have these adaptations where the normal chemicals and those kind of things don't impact them very well. And I think those are kind of the main big ones. Is there anything you can think of that I'm missing?
I would add one more. I mean, I could add a million more, but I will add one more that specifically stands out to me is high succession rate. Because when obviously we think of high reproductive potential, we're probably referring to fauna, but high succession rate and high succession ability, meaning secondary successors after a disturbance, if they're the first ones to germinate. So high succession rate would mean they're quick at germination. They have high germination rates. So a lot of seeds produced and things like that. It's same reproductive potential, but for plants. And they are responsive to that disturbance. That's what makes them good. If I go and take a native prairie with not a single invasive plant in it, and I dump some soil on top of those plants, the first plants that are going to establish there are going to be non-native, probably thistle, right on top of it.
Right.
It's because, and it's seed viability and things like that. A lot of invasive seeds stay for a long time in the seed bank. A lot of invasive plants are really successful because they are carried super easily by, because they have good tasty fruit and, they're carried by birds, blah, 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 all of those things. Yeah. There's invasive species.
I do have one more I just thought of. Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Being a generalist, so not having a really specific food source and or habitat source. So in the fire ant episode, we talked about how they eat anything and they can also live in a range of spaces. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's fine. Invasive species are adaptable, high reproductive potential, quick successors, and hardy. To kind of summarize what we just said.
Anyway, so that was my question I received. Thanks to everybody that submitted questions, and we can do one of these again at some point, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I have fun doing this. It's also less work for me because all I have to do is read the questions that you guys submit and then kind of think out loud. Let us know if you want to see more of this, hear more of this. We'll still do the snips because we do enjoy doing the snips, but this would also help break things up and we might be able to do more question related things. However, we can't do questions if you guys don't ask us questions. And I think a lot of times people are afraid to ask us questions. We can shout you out if you want, but if you want to ask a question where you're like, this is a dumb question, ask it. There are no dumb questions. And if there are dumb questions, I've already asked them. I promise you. No question is dumb because you're just trying to learn it. Even if everybody else in the world knows it, you're just trying to learn that information. There's nothing dumb about wanting to learn about something, even if it's a basic question. So don't be afraid to ask questions. We encourage you to ask questions and let us know if this is something you guys like.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll see you here next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.